Hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 10, Part 1, the U.S. Labor Force. The main idea behind this economics lesson is the American labor force includes all people who are at least 16 years old and are working or actively looking for work. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you will be able to describe factors that affect workers entering the labor force, explain how the U.S. labor force has changed over time, and analyze how the U.S. government affects labor. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. Are you part of the U.S. labor force? The labor force includes all people who are at least 16 years old and are working or actively looking for work. In the United States, more than 130 million people, 2/3 of all people 16 years of age or older, are members of the civilian labor force. The civilian labor force makes up about 98% of all people in the United States who are working or looking for work. The remainder are members of the armed forces or are employed by the military. How do people decide what kinds of jobs they want in the labor force? For many people, the most important factor in choosing an occupation is the salary or wage, the hourly, weekly, monthly, or yearly pay that a worker receives in exchange for his or her labor. Suppose that Sally is looking for a job. In her search, she considers wages, skills, working conditions, location, intrinsic rewards, and market trends. First, Sally should consider what kinds of jobs are in demand and the supply of different kinds of workers. Why is this information important? Just as supply and demand affect the prices of other resources, they also affect the price of labor, or workers' wages. When an occupation has many potential workers but few available jobs, the wage rate tends to be low. For example, imagine that Charles wants to find a job as an admissions counselor for a university. Many other people are interested in this type of job, however, and although there are many colleges and universities in the United States, each has only a few admissions jobs. Because so many people, a high quantity supplied, are interested in a small number of jobs, a low quantity demanded, there is a surplus of workers and the wages are lower than Charles and other applicants might hope to receive. High wages, on the other hand, occur when the number of workers who are interested in, or are qualified for, an occupation is limited, and the demand for them is high. Suppose that housing construction increases in a city and the current number of workers is insufficient to complete the construction projects. Additional workers cannot appear instantly, so a shortage of workers results. If Joe, a general contractor for house building projects, wants to ensure that he will have enough workers to complete his projects on time, he must offer a higher wage than that offered by other contractors. So how do supply and demand affect what occupation Sally should choose? She is more likely to find a good-paying job in an occupation with a high demand for and a low supply of workers. This does not mean, however, that she should base her decision solely on this consideration. Sally should also consider her skills. Think about your skills as a worker. Education, experience, and abilities all affect your skills and help determine what jobs you are and are not eligible to hold. Do you have the skills needed to be a brain surgeon, an airline pilot, or a chef? Probably you have yet to develop all the skills needed for these jobs, and employers likely would not hire you for these positions. Because businesses want to hire only qualified people, skill level can limit the supply of workers. For example, relatively few people attain the skills required to be a professional baseball player or an intensive care nurse. The more skills a particular job requires, the fewer qualified people there are who can perform the job. As you know, the limited supply of labor means that jobs requiring high skill levels usually offer higher wages. Conversely, the fewer skills a job requires, the greater number of qualified people there are for the position. Because of this large supply of labor, low-skilled occupations usually offer lower wages. You, Sally, and other workers thus face the same skill-related questions. Do you want to invest a great deal of time, money, and effort in acquiring the skills needed for a high-paying job? Or are there other considerations you might take into account when entering the labor force? As Sally continues her job search, what might she want to know about conditions in the workplace? In most U.S. workplaces, federal and state laws carefully regulate health and safety concerns, such as noise level and cleanliness. Some high-risk occupations, however, are simply more dangerous to workers. Skyscraper construction, firefighting, and coal mining are examples of hazardous occupations. To compensate for these dangers and to encourage qualified workers to apply, hazardous occupations sometimes pay higher wages than those jobs with low risks to life and limb. In addition to workplace conditions, Sally should consider the locations of the jobs that interest her. Does she want to move to a new area, or would she rather continue to live where she does now? Sometimes employers offer high wages to encourage workers to move to a different area. In some cases, jobs in distant and remote locations pay higher wages to help make up for the isolation. For example, engineers and other specialists who are recruited to work in other nations may receive high salaries. Workers performing the same job in more desirable locations generally receive lower wages. Although Sally certainly wants to earn a good salary, she might seek other types of job satisfaction. Intrinsic rewards are non-monetary reasons for working at a particular job. They include a worker's pride and satisfaction in the quality of work done and the status, prestige, or respect that accompanies a job. People who value a particular intrinsic reward often are willing to accept lower salaries than they might receive in another job that calls for comparable levels of skill and training. Consider the case of Patrick, who is graduating from college with a degree in English. He has the skills to go to law school or to earn a teaching certificate. He knows that he may be able to earn a higher salary as a lawyer than that as a teacher. Patrick, however, wants to increase people's appreciation for literature. He decides to pursue a teaching career because he believes that the intrinsic rewards of teaching are greater than the possible financial rewards of a legal career. Sally also should investigate trends in the careers that interest her. What industries are expanding or contracting? Industries expand to meet increasing needs and wants of consumers, leading to an increase in the need for workers. In other words, consumers' demand for a particular good creates a demand for the labor and other resources needed to produce that good. This process is called derived demand, because the demand for workers and other resources is derived, or follows, from the consumer's demand for the good. Derived demand can cause great changes in employment patterns as producers try to meet new needs and wants of consumers. For example, in the early 1900s, consumer demand shifted from the horse and carriage to the automobile. As a result, the demand for industrial workers in automobile plants increased, while the demand for skilled carriage makers declined. Now you know what people consider before entering the labor force, but who exactly is looking for jobs? The people who make up the labor force and the jobs that they hold are very different today from laborers in jobs in the past. Why is this so? For much of American history, most people in the United States earned their living from agriculture. The introduction of new technologies during the late 1700s and early 1800s, however, encouraged industrialization, the process of mechanizing all major forms of production. Widespread industrialization first occurred in Great Britain in the mid-1700s, during a period that became known as the Industrial Revolution. Soon, other nations, including the United States, followed Britain's lead. Industrialization created new, factory-based jobs, which contributed to an economic shift away from agriculture. This shift led not only to a vast increase in the number and kinds of goods and services available, but also to a greater reliance on the capital goods needed in factory production. Industrialization thus caused the U.S. economy to become capital intensive, or dependent on machines to produce goods. In contrast, agricultural economies are labor intensive, producing goods primarily through animal and human power. How did the shift to the industrialized, capital-intensive economy change the makeup of the U.S. labor force? In the late 1700s, about 80% of the labor force was employed in farm labor. By 1950, farm workers made up only 63% of the labor force, and by 1900, they made up only 37%. Today, less than 3% of the U.S. labor force works in agriculture. In contrast, about 90% of workers hold service and manufacturing jobs. Industrialization also increased the number of females who received wages for their labor. Women often worked on family farms without being paid a separate income. In the early 1800s, however, textile factories in New England began to employ women. By 1900, women working for wages outside the home made up about 18% of the labor force. The number of females in the workforce increased again during World War I, when many women took jobs in defense plants to replace men who had entered the military. In fact, during the war, some 1.5 million American women worked as automobile mechanics, truck drivers, bricklayers, metal workers, railroad engineers, and other industrial laborers. Although many of these women stopped working outside their homes when the war ended, women again entered the labor force in large numbers during World War II. From 1940 to 1944, more than 4 million women held jobs in workplaces such as airplane factories, newspaper offices, and shipyards. The millions of women who joined the labor force in these times of national emergency helped establish a pattern for working outside the home and contributed to a change in public attitudes towards women in the workplace. The number of women in the labor force continues to increase. In 1995, 58.9% of women in the United States were members of the labor force, compared to 75% of men. Smaller family size and an increase in affordable daycare have enabled many women to pursue careers outside the home. In addition, improved access to educational facilities allows women to gain the same level of training as men, and therefore to compete for jobs traditionally held by men. Legislation protecting equal access to jobs also has opened up employment opportunities for women. As you know, increased education has helped improve employment opportunities for women. These improvements have not been limited to women, however. The U.S. labor force in general has become better educated over the years. Many states did not have public school systems until the early 1900s, so education in some areas was largely limited to the wealthy. The development of free public schools and the passage of mandatory attendance laws, however, caused education levels to rise dramatically throughout the 1900s. For example, in 1960, about 41.1% of people over the age of 25 had completed high school. By 1995, this number had nearly doubled, with almost 82% completing high school. Similarly, the number of U.S. residents completing at least 4 years of college increased, from 7.7% in 1960 to 23% in 1995. How do workers benefit from greater access to education? A direct relationship exists between a worker's level of education and his or her income. If you stay in school for at least 16 years, earning a college degree, you probably will be able to get a better job and earn a higher salary than workers with less education. How much more could you earn? In 2023, the average salary for a college graduate in the workforce was $59,600 per year, while the average salary for a person with a master's degree was $69,700. In contrast, the average salary for a high school graduate without any further education was $36,600 per year, and the average high school dropout earned only $29,800. You learned earlier that governments passed attendance laws so that more workers would get an education. This is one example of how the government can affect the labor force. In fact, over time, the U.S. government has become more involved in the economy and other issues affecting the labor force. Specifically, since the 1960s, the federal government has passed several anti-discrimination and minimum wage laws to protect the rights of individual workers. During the 1900s, the government also had passed legislation concerning labor unions, which you will learn about in the next video. During the 1960s, Congress passed a series of laws aimed at protecting workers from discrimination in hiring, promotion, and firing. For example, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires that employers pay the same wages to male and female workers who perform the same job. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects workers from employer discrimination based on race, sex, religion, or national origin. The Act also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. The main task of the EEOC is to monitor and enforce the Act's provisions. In addition, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson began pursuing a policy of affirmative action, or making up for patterns of discrimination against women, members of minority groups, and others who are traditionally disadvantaged in the workplace. Programs were aimed at eliminating racial and gender bias in the employment practices of firms doing business with the federal government. The Department of Labor soon established a practice of relying on what amounted to quotas, or numerical goals, for hiring and promoting women and minorities. Affirmative action has stirred up controversy between employees and employers. Supporters have argued that affirmative action is the only effective method of ending workplace discrimination. Opponents counter that affirmative action is itself a form of discrimination because it offers special treatment to one group of citizens at the expense of another. The Supreme Court has acted to make sure that affirmative action does not discriminate against people who are not members of minority groups. In the case of Regents of the University of California versus Bakey in 1978, the court ruled that a California medical school could not reserve a certain number of seats for minority students in the incoming class. According to the court's ruling, that quota violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it made race the sole factor in admissions. The Supreme Court did maintain, however, that race could be one of several factors used to determine admissions. Since Bakey, the Supreme Court has made decisions ensuring that affirmative action is not used to discriminate against those who are not members of minority groups. In a 2003 ruling, Grutter versus Bollinger, the court found that the University of Michigan Law School's admissions policy that gave special consideration for applicants of certain racial minorities did not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. However, on the same day, the justices handed down their decision in Gratz versus Bollinger, which held that Michigan's undergraduate admissions policy violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because its ranking system gave an automatic point increase to all racial minorities rather than making individual determinations. In addition to anti-discrimination laws, the government has passed legislation to ensure that workers are paid a basic level of income. One of the most important pieces of legislation to do this established a national minimum wage, or the lowest hourly wage an employer legally can pay a worker for a job. The first minimum wage was set at 40 cents per hour in the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. This wage applied only to businesses engaged in interstate commerce, or trade that crosses state boundaries. Furthermore, the law did not apply to farm laborers, domestic servants, and some other groups. Over time, the Fair Labor Standards Act was extended to a wider range of jobs. For example, the Supreme Court ruled in Garcia v. San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority in 1985 that the federal minimum wage and overtime regulations should be applied to the millions of people who work for state and local governments. Today, more than 95% of all employees are covered by the minimum wage law. As you can see in this chart, from 1938 till the present, the federal minimum wage has increased from 40 cents per hour to the current $7.25 an hour, set in 2009. So that's the way it is with Lesson 10, Part 1, the U.S. labor force. At this point, you should know that wages, skills, working conditions, location, intrinsic rewards, and market trends are factors that affect workers entering the labor force. The U.S. labor force has changed by becoming a capital-intensive economy, as well as increases in both the number of women in higher education levels to meet the skills needed to enter the workforce, and the U.S. government has passed anti-discrimination and minimum wage laws that have affected labor. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of economics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons. See ya!